Hello, and welcome to Botany 101. I'm Angela Nishimoto. Okay, last time what we were talking about is we were talking about fungi. We finished the fungi, so to speak, okay? And then we started on the plants, all right? And we started on the bryophytes, or the non-vascular plants, okay? So today, we're going to do bryophytes part 2, okay? And last time we were talking about the asexual reproduction of the thalloid liverworts, right? So right now we're going to get into the sexual reproduction of thalloid liverworts, okay? So gametangia are formed on gametophores that are produced on separate male and female gametophytes, okay? Remember, gametophytes are the plants that bear the gametes, okay? The top of the male is disc-like. Okay, this is actually showing some antheridia with the spermatids, which will become the sperm later on. Okay, and the top of female is like a coconut tree. You can actually see sort of the fronds here that I would call of the so-called coconut tree. Yeah, so generally you have one egg cell. Okay, and then you have a tube called a venter. Okay. Okay, in the female archegonium. Okay, so here, this is these are antheridia, and this is that disc-like, umbrella-like male gametophyte or male gametophore. Okay, and antheridia have numerous sperm. Okay, and the sperm and the sperm have flagella. And the archegonia has a single egg each, okay? So of course, these plants need water. The sperm are flagellated in the antheridia, and water splashes the sperm out of the antheridia, and eventually they'll swim into the archegonium, okay? And then after fertilization, the zygote develops into an embryo. Okay, and this embryo is actually diploid, right? And it will actually be completely dependent on the gametophyte. Okay, the zygote doesn't actually, the embryo doesn't actually make its own food. Okay, and the sporophyte becomes completely dependent on the gametophyte. The sporophyte is sort of like a little coconut, you know, emerging from under the fronds of the female gametophore. Okay, so the foot anchors the sporophyte in the archegoniophores, right, or the female parts, right, and sporophyte hangs by a stalk called a seta. Okay, that's a thick stalk. Okay, so the embryo is a miniature sporophyte, and the sporophyte remains on the gametophyte, the female gametophyte, and the foot anchors the sporophyte in the female part. Okay, now the main part of the sporophyte is capsules. This is a great image. It actually shows the female. See, they look like little coconut trees with these little things hanging down. Yeah, so under here is where the sporophytes would be, and they're sort of brownish or maybe a creamish color, okay, depending on the species, right? So this here is a female gametophyte, thalloid liverwort, and these are the female gametophores, okay? So the main part of the sporophyte is a capsule, okay? Then cells inside called sporocytes undergo meiosis, okay? So the main part of the sporophyte is a capsule, and the sporocytes go through meiosis in the capsule, okay? And what they'll do is they'll produce haploid spores, right? Because meiosis, remember, actually reduces the chromosome number by half, okay? Now there are other cells that develop into structures called elaters, okay, elaters, and these elaters kind of twist and untwist rapidly, okay? These are like long stringy structures inside the capsule, and they help to break up the mass of spores. They're sensitive to changes in humidity, so they'll twist and untwist and break up the spore mass. Okay? So that is sexual reproduction in thalloid liverworts. Okay. Now other thalloid forms, okay, are floating or amphibious liverworts. Kind of interesting, yeah? What they do is they do not produce gametophores, okay? Instead, the archegonia and antheridia develop within the thallus beneath the central grooves, okay, where the sporophytes are formed too. The spores are dispersed as the thallus decays, right? Now we have leafy liverworts as well, not just thalloid liverworts, but leafy liverworts too, so-called leafy, even though they don't have true leaves, okay? So for example, we have the Freulania species, okay? So these are abundant in the tropical forests, and they have 2 rows of overlapping leaves. You notice that it has these quotation marks around leaves, the word leaves. That means they don't produce true leaves, not yet. These plants don't produce true leaves, okay? Now the female structure, the archegonia, and the male structure, the antheridia, are produced in cup-like structures, okay, made of modified so-called leaves, okay? And when mature, the sporophyte is pushed out, okay, by the water being absorbed, okay? Then the spores germinate and form gametophytes. Okay, so here's a image of Freulania species. Okay, you can see the green parts here, other parts here, maybe parts that are no longer living, but it's a leafy liverwort. Okay? So that ends our little portion on liverworts, and we're going to go on to the phylum Anthocerophyta, also known as the hornworts. Okay? They make up approximately 100 species. There's not that many of them. Okay? And the mature sporophyte looks like horns. That's why they're called hornworts. Remember that wort means plant, and horn, of course, means horn. So they're like horn plants. Okay? The interesting thing about them is the chloroplasts have these structures called pyrenoids. Okay? Pyrenoids are protein structures that are associated with starch formation. Okay? And these pyrenoids are similar to those that are in green algae. Okay, so remember that the green plants actually descended from green algae, right? So we have the Anthoceros species, okay? So rhizoids, which are not true roots, okay? Rhizoids help to anchor the plant into whatever medium it finds itself in. Another thing rhizoids do is they actually absorb water, okay? So that's kind of the structure. So here we're going to look at this a little later in a little bit more depth, but here we have part of the hornwort. Here are some spores that happen after meiosis. They actually grow into what they call a protonema, which is a growth that comes from a spore, okay? And then they develop into the gametophyte here, okay? Here's an antheridium that makes sperm, flagellated sperm in this case also. Here's an archegonium with an egg in it. So the sperm swims through the egg. Okay, and then what it does, it develops into a sporophyte here. Okay, and that actually grows and becomes a horn, part of the hornwort. Okay? Now asexual reproduction, okay, mainly due through fragmentation. Okay, as the lobes separate from the main part of the thallus, okay, they fragment and they actually become new plants, okay. And there are a few asexual reproduction that occurs through tiny tubers that happens in the hornworts, okay. Now sexual reproduction have to do similar to the liverworts with archegonia and antheridia, okay? So these are just beneath the surface of the gametophyte, okay? Now some species of hornworts have unisexual plants, okay? Others have bisexual plants. That means that some have only archegonia, some have only antheridia, or some species have only archegonia gametophytes and antheridia gametophytes, or female and male gametophytes. And then there's some that have both archegonia and antheridia on the same gametophyte, okay, or they're bisexual. Okay, as the sporophyte grows, the sporocytes, or the sites that produce the spores, undergo meiosis. Okay. They produce spores. Okay, and also elaters are in this group is also produced. Okay, and then what happens is that the tip of the horn splits into 2 or 3 pieces. Okay, like ribbon-like segments, because remember this is long and narrow. Okay, and when they split, they release the spores. Okay. Anyway, so that is what we have to say about the Anthocerophyta. Now we come to the phylum Bryophyta, also known as the mosses. Okay, so one of the things is that almost any greenish covering or growth on trees and on the floors of the forest have been called mosses. Okay, so you have some lichens like reindeer moss, red algae like Irish moss, flowering plants such as Spanish moss is actually a kind of bromeliad. Okay, and club mosses, which look like a large moss, but they're actually vascular plants with xylem and phloem. Okay, we'll go into those later. Okay, but the mosses, the true mosses, okay, are about 15,000 species known. Okay, and they're in 3 classes. The peat mosses, or the sphagnum species. Isn't that a beautiful image? The true mosses. Okay, and then the rock mosses, the Grimmia species. Okay, so the leaves are here again in these Bryophyta, the mosses. You don't have true leaves, okay, but the so-called leaves are these little structures here. They look like leaves, don't they? But they're not really leaves. They're actually just structures that actually help absorb moisture and do photosynthesis. The so-called leaves of moss gametophytes different from angiosperm leaves. Okay, they have no mesophyll. Remember, mesophyll is the part between the upper and lower epidermis of a leaf. Okay, they have no stomates or no pores through which gas exchange occurs or transpiration. They have no veins, because remember, the bryophytes have no vascular tissue. They're actually sometimes called the non-vascular plants. Okay, they have no xylem or phloem. Okay, and these so-called leaves are nearly always only 1 cell thick, except at the midrib. Okay, that kind of runs lengthwise down the middle. Then it may be more thicker than 1 cell. Okay, they're never lobed or divided. They're always one piece. And there's no petiole or leaf stem. Okay? Now the axis is stem-like. Okay? There's no xylem or phloem. Okay, remember there's no vascular tissue in the bryophytes. Okay? And at the base of the stem part are the rhizoids. Okay, rhizoids are not truly roots, but they're root-like. Okay, they anchor the plant. All right. They also help absorb water. But water is absorbed directly through plant surfaces, whether it's the so-called leaves or part of the stem or part of the rhizoids. Okay. So most water is absorbed directly through the plant surfaces. Now, asexual reproduction. This is kind of interesting. Now, in the lab, the cells of moss or archegonia, the female parts of the gametophyte, or the antheridia, or the male parts of the gametophyte, other structures called paraphyses, the leaves, the stem, the rhizoids can actually develop protonema. Protonema, remember, we talked about that. They're actually, did we talk about that? They're actually developing from the spores, right? Protonema develop from the spores, they green up, and they develop into gametophytes. Okay, so protonema can develop from cells or archegonia, antheridia, paraphyses, so-called leaves, stem, and rhizoids. They can develop protonema, so they can do asexual reproduction that way. Okay, Another thing is there are 2 American biologists that went out and collected fragments of moss gametophytes from a snow bed. So they were actually frozen. Okay, they tried to grow them in culture, and about 12% grew in culture. Okay, so this suggests that wind dispersal, that parts of fragments, you know, that is wind dispersed or blown about by the wind, and then it becomes a whole new plant on its own, is routine, that it happens all the time. Okay? Now, sexual reproduction. Now, gametangia are formed at the tips of the leafy shoots of the gametophytes. Okay? Like the liverwort and hornwort, the archegonium has a single egg. The antheridia, okay, are on seta or short stalks, or not seta, but short stalks. And they produce sperm cells, just like the other ones we've seen. And when water is absorbed, this too, they're forced out when water is absorbed. Okay? Now, the interesting thing with this group too is that the archegonium releases some kind of substance, whether it's a sugar or proteins or acids, or some other substance that attracts the sperm. Do you remember what that's called? Remember we talked about that just a few sessions ago? It's called chemotropism, right? So the archegonium releases substances that make the sperms swim toward them. So then the sperm swims into the archegonium, fuses with the egg, and the egg and the sperm becomes a diploid zygote, okay? And the zygote develops into an embryo. So like the liverworts, like the hornworts, okay, mosses also have the embryo anchored by foot, okay, into the gametophyte. And generally what happens is that you have a maternal investment into the next generation, okay, because the embryo grows on the gametophyte, okay. The embryo grows and develops into the sporophyte, okay. It's green and photosynthetic. So the sporophyte is green and photosynthetic in mosses, but it also depends on the gametophyte for some carbohydrates and also for water and minerals, or some water and minerals. Okay? So the capsule is at the tip of the seta, which is that stalk, remember? And the sporocytes inside the capsule undergo meiosis and develop into haploid spores. And most of these spores are wind dispersed. Okay. So the spore germinates, grows into a protonema, and that develops into the gametophyte. Okay, so here's a nice image here we can kind of look at. Okay, so here we have the male gametophyte here in pink, and the female gametophyte here in blue. Okay, and the female gametophyte has archegonia. The male gametophyte has the antheridia, okay, which produce sperm. Each archegonium produces 1 egg, okay. So generally mosses, like liverworts, like hornworts, tend to live in wet places or places that have water, whether it's dew or rain or running water, or just water that happens to be in the atmosphere, okay. So the sperm needs to swim to the egg in the archegonia, okay, and then when fertilization happens, when the sperm fuses with egg, the flagellated sperm fuses with the egg, that develops into the diploid zygote. The zygote grows and undergoes mitosis and develops into the sporophyte. Okay, so you have an early embryo, and then you have the developing embryo that develops into the sporophyte. That has this covering called a calyptra, which is actually part of the maternal tissue. Okay. Anyway, what happens next is the sporophyte in the capsule. This is also the capsule. That is where meiosis happens. Meiosis develops the spores. Okay, you have myospores or spores that develop, okay, and sprout, okay, and develop into the protonema, okay, and then that develops into the gametophyte, okay. You have young gametophytes with some of its so-called stems, growing here. And the gametophyte then continues on with this alternation of generation, where you have a diploid sporophyte generation alternating with a haploid gametophyte generation. The diploid sporophyte being the plant that bears the spores, and the haploid gametophyte being the plant that bears the gametes. Okay? Now, the human and ecological relevance of the bryophytes. Okay? The bryophytes and the lichens are pioneers on bare rock. Here's some bryophytes here growing on these tiles. Okay? Here's a lichen. Remember a lichen from the last lecture? Yeah? A lichen is a symbiotic association between an alga or a cyanobacterium and a fungus. Okay? So these are pioneers on bare rock, and pioneering actually talks about ecology. Okay? Another thing they do, okay, that they will be pioneers on bare rock after volcanic eruptions and other upheavals and the movements of glaciers, and what they'll do is they'll accumulate minerals and organic matter, okay, that allows other organisms to grow on or near them. Okay, so they can actually be used by other organisms, this organic matter and minerals that the bryophytes and the lichens accumulate. Okay, so that allows for succession. Succession happens just like in ecology, where, let's see, like a grassland can become shrubland, and then that eventually becomes forest as larger plants come in and take over. That's what they call succession, where one kind of dominant vegetation actually is superseded by other kinds of vegetation sequentially as it goes along. Okay? Okay, if we can go back to the slides. Okay, so mosses retain moisture. Okay, they slowly release the moisture into the soil. All right, and that reduces flooding and erosion. Okay, so they do have ecological and human relevance. Okay, another thing they do is they form humus, okay, which is like organic material that is part of the soil, which is very necessary for healthy soils. Okay, not just that, is that Native Americans use mosses for diapers, very absorbent, and also under splints for broken bones. Okay. Now, the most important kind of moss to humans have been peat mosses. Okay. Remember what we had talked about earlier about World War I and them using the peat moss as a dressing for wounds? Okay. Now, this is quite amazing. 1 kilogram of dry peat moss, this is actually some peat moss or decomposed peat moss, okay? It can actually take up 25 kilograms or 55 pounds of water, so it's very absorbent, okay? Therefore, it's A1 as a soil conditioner, and also as a main component of potting media, for use with plants that you need to pot in non-soil media, because of course if you pot it in a soil media, you have the problems of pests like nematodes and such like that. So if you wanted to ship a plant out of Hawaii, you need to actually have non-soil media that you need to use. Okay, it's also quite clean, so they ship live shellfish in this peat mosses. Okay, so like live oysters, like the ones that you eat at nice restaurants. If you like shellfish, I'm allergic to shellfish, so I used to like oysters, but I got allergic to them, so I can't eat them anymore. Nor shrimps, nor clams, none of that stuff. I can't have that anymore. But there are other things to eat, so I'm okay. Okay, so peat moss has natural acidity. That's very important. That was important in terms of the use of the peat moss for dressing, or sphagnum moss for the dressing of wounds, right? Sphagnum species for dressings of wounds. Okay, now this acidity is also useful in terms of using it as a medium, because if it's a little bit acid, it discourages the presence of some bacteria, some fungi won't grow in it, okay? Now, one thing that a nursery that I worked for, what they did was they actually had sphagnum moss, which is expensive. They sell them in bales, like 35-pound bales or something like that, 40-pound bales. And what they did was they actually got the sphagnum moss, they boiled water, poured it over it. So what that did is it killed any bacterium or any fungus, any microbe that was living in the sphagnum. Then they'd use that as a potting media for special plants that they wanted to make sure didn't die, you know? So, so that's one way you can actually make sure your medium is really clean. Even if you're using the decomposed kind of peat moss, you can actually sterilize it by pouring boiling water over it, letting it sit, cool off, and just draining the water out. Not only will it sterilize the medium, but it will also wet the medium down, so it will take plants better. If you've tried to pot with peat moss or sphagnum moss, you know that when it dries out, it's really hard to re-wet it, you know. It's always good to keep it evenly moist, okay? Okay, so it has natural acidity, so it inhibits fungal and bacterial growth. It also has antiseptic properties. Okay, remember that they were used as poultice material for wounds during World War I, but also during the Crimean War in the 1800s. That was in Russia, I think, Crimean War. Yeah. So peat is used as a soil conditioner, okay, to help condition soils and help it retain water as well as help it drain. It does both at the same time. That's what you want with a potting medium, okay. It was also used, it has also been used as a fuel. You've heard of the Irish bog people, or people who live near the bogs, that they actually cut out peat, decomposed peat moss for use in their fires, for cooking, as well as for keeping themselves warm, Ireland being a very cold place, but it had lots of bogs. Okay, a lot of these places are kind of being depleted of its peat moss because it's in high demand in our modern world. Okay, it's also used to make Scotch whiskey. Okay, so sprouted barley is dried over a peat fire to make Scotch whiskey. Okay, that imparts that smoky flavor to the Scotch whiskey. I had a friend who liked Scotch and Scotch on the rocks. I think she liked to drink that. Yeah, I myself never got used to it. I myself, I don't drink alcohol anymore. But I had fun before. That's okay. Now we come to something called hibernating mosses. Okay, this is very interesting. They're the amphibians of the plant world. Amphi means both, and bians refers to living, so they can actually live under different circumstances. They can live in semi-aquatic environments, okay, like moist stream banks, okay. They can sometimes also live in drier habitats, these hibernating mosses as well, like rock surfaces or Arctic tundra, okay. But of course, all mosses depend on water to reproduce because their sperms are flagellated. They need water so they can swim to the egg, or it's all lost, right? If they can't reproduce. That's what evolution teaches us, right? Unless you're reproductively successful, you're not really evolutionarily successful, okay? Now these hibernating mosses have this ecological diversity which is exceptional, okay? They can take dry heat, rock faces, tree trunks, deserts, where they live in these areas, and they can tolerate desiccation. They can actually dry up. And so when the air is dry, the plant is dry, okay? But when it's wet, the plants are wet, okay? So what that means is that they're opportunists, okay? So what they can do is they can actually return from the dead. They can be totally dried out practically. And then you wet them, and within minutes they start during respiration again. Okay? So many of hibernating mosses form dense mats, okay, and create a moist microenvironment for other organisms. Okay? So that's more uses. This Polytrichum commune, okay, it actually grows in bogs and temperate moist forests. Isn't that beautiful? It grows luxuriantly in the rainy season, but it twists into rusty red mats when they dry, okay? But they have a thin cuticle on the leaves. I guess the leaves are these little pointy things sticking up. Remember, these aren't true leaves, okay? True leaves have vascular tissue. True leaves have stomates, okay? True leaves, well, this one has a cuticle, okay? And they have water conducting cells called hydroids. So they don't really have xylem, but they have water conducting cells, okay? And what these do is they help to move water through the plant, okay? They have rhizoids, right? And we talked about rhizoids before. They absorb water as well as helping to anchor the plant. Okay. Now this other plant called Tortula ruralis, okay, is one of the most desiccation tolerant mosses known. Okay, the hydrated cells are similar to mesophyll cells. Remember the middle leaf cells that we talked about before in vascular plants. You have the palisade mesophyll, you have the spongy mesophyll, okay? So the hydrated cells of this moss is similar to the mesophyll cells that are in vascular plants. They have chloroplasts with grana. Remember, attacks of the thylakoid membranes actually form the grana, okay? They have numerous mitochondria, and these mitochondria are similar to those of higher plants. Because remember, we're talking about the non-vascular plants now, the so-called most primitive of all the plants in the kingdom Plantae. Okay? So the desiccated leaves, so-called leaves, fold up, okay, when it's dry, okay? And the cells get damaged, you get plasmolysis, or the cell membrane pulls away from the cell wall as the living part of the cell shrivel. Okay. The chloroplasts get smaller. Okay, it doesn't have any starch anymore. Another thing is that the grana, the stacks of thylakoid membranes are collapsed. Okay. The mitochondria are smaller and rounded. Okay. And photosynthesis stops and respiration slows or stops. Okay. Now the same plant, so this is what happens when it dries up. Okay. The leaves fold up, the desiccated leaves fold up, the cell's damaged, okay, the chloroplast, grana collapsed, okay, the mitochondria smaller, photosynthesis stops, and respiration slows or stops, and that's amazing. It's like it's dead, okay? Now the same plant, the rehydrated, you add water to a dried up Tortula ruralis, the leaves unfold, the so-called leaves unfold, and most of the internal damage that happened to it when it dried up is repaired within minutes, okay? You have this drought repair gene, the activity of it increases and repair proteins are made, okay? Respiration resumes within minutes, and photosynthesis resumes up to 24 hours later. Okay, so isn't that amazing? Okay? This is like a raised from the dead. So the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Research Service, okay, is looking for genes for drought repair of crop plants. They want to actually transfer them to crop plants. So they're looking for genes and whatever they can find for drought repair. And of course, this Tortula ruralis has it, okay? So they can make drought less of a problem, all right? So then they can also use dry lands that are not suitable for agriculture, okay? Then they can grow engineered crop plants this way. especially if it's engineered to withstand drought. Okay, they can also grow the plants in less arid regions too. Crops with drought tolerance need less water. Okay, so here's some benefits to this. Okay. Now, one thing to remember is that the human population has increases of 1.6% per year. Think of that in terms of billions of people. Okay, so in order to sustain this human population growth, we need an additional 78,000 metric tons of grain per day. Okay, so this is interesting how some lowly moss might be responsible for a revolution in food production. Okay. Okay, now we're going to move on to something else, right? So we finished with the non-vascular plants, and now we're going to move on to ferns and their relatives. They're also known as the lower vascular plants in some old texts. Okay? So ferns and their relatives are plants that have conducting tissues. They have xylem and they have phloem. Xylem moves water in the plant and phloem moves food in the plant, or sugar. Okay? These ferns and their relatives also do not produce seeds, just like the bryophytes, the liverworts or hornworts and the mosses. They produce spores, right? So ferns and the relatives also produce spores. They do not produce seeds. Okay? You have vascular plant evolution. Look at those trees. Okay? So xylem and phloem developed. Okay, so this is actually looking at looks like a dicot to me. Yeah? Anyway, so you have the xylem that conducts water. You have, let's see, phloem out here that moves sugar or food in the plant. And in this dicot, you have vascular cambium right here between the xylem and the phloem. So you have primary phloem that came from primary growth. You have primary xylem from primary growth. You have secondary xylem from secondary growth. Okay. Here you have bark from the cork cambium. Okay, that produced the bark of this tree. So this is actually an angiosperm that we're looking at right now, but we have the idea of xylem and phloem. So ferns and their relatives have water-conducting cells and food-conducting cells. Okay. And they also have true leaves and roots, except for Xylodon, the Xylotaceae, okay, the Xylophyta. Okay, they have true leaves and roots. The Xylophyta do not have true leaves and roots. Another thing about the ferns and the relatives, remember that in the bryophytes, in the hornworts, the liverworts, and the mosses, the gametophyte is dominant. The gametophyte is larger. The gametophyte is photosynthetic. Okay? But in ferns and their relatives, the gametophyte got smaller and also more dependent on the sporophytes. So in the ferns and their relatives, or the lower vascular plants, the sporophyte is dominant. Okay? Those look like heart-shaped gametophytes of ferns. The sporophyte got larger, okay, and protected the gametophyte. Okay, see, the sporophyte gets larger and this actually looks like an embryo in here. Yeah. Okay. Now there are 4 phyla, or groupings, of seedless vascular plants, or lower vascular plants. You have the Xylophyta, or the whisk ferns. You have the Lycophyta, the club mosses, and the quillworts. You have the Equisetophita, or the horsetails and scouring rushes. Aren't they beautiful, yeah? And the Polypodiophyta, the ferns. Just gorgeous. Look at this fiddlehead on this fern. Okay. Now all of these 4 groupings share a single ancestor. Okay. And people also think, so here and here, you can see some similarities between these two. I think this is Selaginella. So seed plants also descended from this group of ferns and the relatives. The first seed plants were what they called the seed ferns. Okay. Okay, now the phylum Xylophyta, or the whisk ferns. Okay. They don't really look like ferns in terms of how they look like. Okay. The name of the one genus that still exists is Xylotum. That's a genus name. Okay. It doesn't really look like a fern, even though it's grouped with, it's called a whisk fern. But it looks like sort of like a small green whisk broom. Okay, we'll show you one in a little bit. Okay. So these are the simplest of all seedless vascular plants. So you can see part of it, these photosynthetic stems. Okay. And here are the sporangia, the parts of them that bear the spores. Okay. Now the sporophytes, the dominant sporophytes, have dichotomous forking stems. That means that the stem goes into twos, like one stem branches into two, one stem branches into two. Okay, so you have dichotomous forking stems. Okay. They have no leaves or roots, no true leaves, no true roots. Okay. They're about 1 to 3 feet tall. And they have a short branching rhizome underground. Remember what rhizomes are? Remember that rhizomes are horizontal underground stems, right? So the above ground stem portion part comes from a rhizome, or an underground stem. Okay, sort of like ginger, you know, but of course ginger is actually a flowering plant. Anyway, so ginger is actually come from a rhizome that grows underground, sends up these leafy stems, right? So similar to that, Xylotum does something similar to that. Okay. So they have these tiny green, superficially leaf-like structures called innations. Okay. These are veinless, because one thing that a leaf has is veins. Okay. So they are veinless, photosynthetic flaps of tissue. And they're spirally arranged along the stem. Okay. So structure and form, look at that, aren't they beautiful? I'm sure some of you are acquainted with whisk ferns. You probably have them growing in your pots of potted plants at home, if you have some, or seen them growing on trees like that. There are actually 2 native species of whisk fern in Hawaii. We'll talk about them a little bit later. Okay. So the rhizoids act like root hairs, and they're helped by mycorrhizal fungi. Remember mycorrhizae? They form a relationship. These are fungi that form a relationship with the roots of most plant species, including the non-vascular plants, including the lower vascular plants. Mycorrhizae actually form relationships with plants, whether it's non-vascular plants, the lower vascular plants, or the gymnosperms, or the angiosperms. They all have interactions with fungi. Fungi are extremely important to the health of many different kinds of plants. Plants need them. They help them get water, they help them get food, they help shelter them, okay? Even though some fungi actually prey on them too, okay? So these mycorrhizal fungi live along the surfaces of the rhizomes. Remember, rhizomes are not roots, remember they're stems, okay? So they have small sporangia that are yellow, fused threes, okay? And they're produced in the more upper parts of the stems. And the spores germinate slowly, okay, very slowly. So if you try to get some spores and try to sow them, you may be frustrated because they actually need their mycorrhizae in order to germinate and to grow, okay? Anyway, so they'll germinate slowly, either in soil or tree bark or tree fern bark or some other place. Like in Hawaii, they'll grow on old lava flows. And they'll grow in pots of orchids or ferns. Okay, some of you have them growing, maybe you might not want them there, but they're pretty good plants. They're nice plants. They're very attractive. You can use them in lei, you know, in like a hala lei and like that. So here's a sporangium. So you have these 3 parts of the sporangia. And here you have some spores, whitish spores. Okay, so this is Xylodum nudum. This is the erect species of Xylodum that we have in Hawaii. It grows upward. Okay, there's also another species called Xylodum complanatum that is pendant, or it hangs downward. And there are also probably many hybrids between Xylodum nudum and Xylodum complanatum in the Hawaiian forests. Okay, but these are 2 native species of Xylodum, or the Xylophyta. Okay, so here we're looking at a life cycle here. Okay, so here you have the sporophyte of Xylodum. Okay, and here you have it actually making sporangia. Okay, so eventually you have a 3-parted sporangia undergoing meiosis, releasing a spore that develops into a gametophyte, okay, which tends to be kind of colorless and not very conspicuous. Okay, so the gametophyte has archegonio and antheridia, like the other species we've seen earlier, the other groupings we've seen earlier. The antheridia here, the archegonia here. The sperms are flagellated, so generally too, Xylodum needs to live in a kind of wet environment, or one that's not too dry. Okay, so the sperm swims to the egg, forms the embryo, and that grows into the sporophyte, and the process continues. So you see this alternation of generation between a diploid sporophyte and a haploid gametophyte, right? The sporophyte is a plant that makes the spores through meiosis, okay? And the gametophyte actually produces the gametes, okay, the sperm and eggs that will come together in fertilization, okay? So we have diploid, haploid, meiosis, and fertilization, the 4 points of an alternation of generation in plants. Okay? Now the gametophytes develop under surfaces, and they're not very big. Yeah, they're not very conspicuous. They're only like less than 1/10 of an inch. That is less than 1/10 of an inch, by about 1/4 of an inch large. Another thing is that they don't have chlorophyll, so they're sort of like a light brown kind of color, and they're kind of transparent. Okay, so they're not easy to find. Okay, and they absorb nutrients via their rhizoids, so they don't do photosynthesis, of course, the gametophytes. Okay, but they're helped along by the faithful old mycorrhizal fungi. Okay, so the archegonia and antheridia develop randomly. Okay, the sperm fuses with the egg in the archegonium, like we just saw. The zygote, the diploid zygote, develops. Okay, and the rhizome will produce upright stems or pendant stems, depending on what kind of Xylodum it is. Okay, so we have them native to tropical and subtropical areas. So in the United States, they're native in Florida, Louisiana, Texas, Arizona, and Hawaii. Okay, an interesting thing is that they're extensively cultivated in Japan. So in Japan, they really like these plants. Okay, but in other places, sometimes they're considered a real pest, a weed in greenhouses around the world. Okay, so it depends whether you like them or not, you know. So what is a weed? A weed is a plant that's growing where you don't want it to grow. That's what a weed is. Okay, now this hard to pronounce word, Timacipterus. Okay, it's a close relative with leaf-like appendages. It's kind of interesting looking thing here. Okay, and that's native to Australia and the South Pacific. Okay, the fossil whisk fern lookalikes. Okay, you have the Silurian geological formation, so that's a geological period, and that was up to 400 million years old. Okay, and so this is what the Earth is supposed to have looked like during the Silurian period. Okay, where all these groupings of continents all over the place. I mean, not really all over the place, but all concentrated in different areas. Okay, and this, you had Cooksonia and Rhynia. They had naked stems, photosynthetic stems probably, and terminal sporangia. Sounds a lot like Psilotum. And look, it looks a lot like Psilotum too. This is like a reconstruction of Rhynia. Okay, so you can see the sporangia here. So you have these naked stems. You might even have venations. Okay. And then you also had Zostaurophyllum, had rounded sporangia in the upper parts of naked stems. So actually, it first appeared in the Devonian period, and these may be ancestral to the club mosses, which we'll talk about next time. Okay, so here are actual fossils that show the imprints of Zostaurophyllum. Okay, so this is from Devon, looks like. Okay. So whisk fern spores are oily. Okay. So it could be used for moisturizer. They were used, the whisk fern spores were used by Hawaiian men for irritation from the malo, you know, from chafing. Okay. Another local use for it here in Hawaii was that Hawaiian people also made a laxative by boiling the whole plant with water. Okay, so that's the thing, is that in Hawaii people are very concerned about keeping clean, you know, both on the inside of the body and on the outside of the body. There are different plants that were used for purgatives to clean out the insides, and of course Hawaiian people are very clean. They used to actually maybe go into the ocean 2 or 3 times a day and then rinse themselves off in fresh water, so they're very clean people, you know, and that was not unusual for people to actually go into the ocean 2 or 3 times a day, something like that, and then rinse off with fresh water. Okay, anyway, that's all the time we have for today, for our little journey through the plant kingdom here. Okay, we'll pick it up again next time, and we'll see you then. Aloha.